the background of the community statement, it's been weird. You know, I've known for a couple months that we were going to do this series, and I actually can't get a clear memory of really how it came to be. But it really is maybe the last couple months of 2008. I had left a bad situation in a church and was in the process of getting ready to finish seminary, and a group of people were starting to kind of meet in our neighborhood, and then eventually started meeting in the beginning of 2009 at Cafe Da Vinci. And somewhere in there, I wrote this statement, as it is. It hasn't ever been edited since then. And it is one of those experiences where the more that I look back on it, the more I realize that it was something from beyond me. You know, I guess I would call that a spiritual experience, because I think the wisdom, not even that's in the statement, but I think the wisdom that it calls us to is something that a 24-year-old doesn't have. What is the community statement? Since I wrote it, you'd think I know. I don't. So let you down. And we don't really much do answers around here, but we live with some really good questions. So I think that's probably maybe one of the ones that we'll live with for a while. But I think I have maybe some things that I think, suggestions, images. And I think it begins with that idea that the statement transcends me and my understanding. And I think it really actually transcends even this group, this congregation. I think it speaks to people, or at least I hope it does, in such a way that I think it can only really be gotten at in a community. I don't think one person can sit down and understand it. I think we can only really, quote unquote, understand it by living it together and sort of experiencing it together. That being said, the image I'm working with from the Exodus text, I think of it as a promised land. In the Exodus story, if you're not familiar, so the slaves are in Egypt, and then God uses Moses. They're liberated, and they go and wander around the desert for 40 years, and they complain a lot, and they wish that they had gone back to Egypt because at least they had food there, and God says, you really should trust me, and they don't trust God, and so they keep getting off course, and essentially they wander for 40 years. And they fight, and they repeat the same mistakes, and they break commands, and they lie to themselves and to one another, and they lie to God over this sort of 40-year journey. And 40 years is a biblical way of saying a very long time, or maybe we could even think of it as a lifetime. But over the course of this journey, they become these people called Israel. They sort of form a communal identity. So they come to belong, and it was interesting, we talked about this at Occupy Trilogy, that idea that there is some sense of the human search to belong. And I think Kathy said is actually, to sort of phrase it another way, is the longing to be yourself, to be okay, to be accepted, to be loved, to be able to tell the truth about who you are and be known. So the search to belong or the longing to be. And the longing to be is not satisfied in a physical space called the promised land. I think what we find is that the promise is actually the community with whom they've traveled the whole time. They find, because even when they get there, it's not the way it was going to be, and it's not this ideal sort of, like it says in the text, the land flowing with milk and honey. It just isn't. So they realize the promised land is this group that they've been with. This is their community. And I hope the same is kind of true with the community statement, that it's more of a direction. It's a hope. It's this idealized picture of where we think we might be going. But it's not an object. It's not a thing as much as it is a hoped for experience, driven by imagination, driven by desire. And so community statement is a promised land, this way of life formation articulated in the community statement. It's not a place. It's not a land. It's not an arrival. It's a communal experience. In that sense, it's sort of a promised land that we never really reach because we're always sort of already with it. So it's got that kind of dichotomy going on. I think it's also a call, and I'm using this phrase very specifically. This is from a philosopher called John Caputo. And he says a call is not on the order of existence. A call doesn't exist. You can't get there. But he says a call is on what's called the vocative order. That is, it's a voice. It calls to us. It haunts us. It spooks us. And so he might say the life in the community imagined in the community statement doesn't exist, but it insists. That is, it isn't a thing. It's not a place we can go. It's not a thing we can all do and be. It's the thing that haunts us, that every week says, keep going. You're headed in that direction. You're okay. You're still wandering, but yeah. So in the image that he uses, and I think Paul Tillich picks up on this also, who's a theologian, he says democracy is like this, right? We all, if I say democracy, everyone in the room understands sort of what I'm talking about, and yet democracy doesn't exist. At least not perfectly. We don't live in a democracy. Democracy has never existed. But democracy is the thing that continues to insist as we figure out what it means to live in a democracy, to make it come true. So the same thing is kind of what I'm saying about the community statement. It doesn't exist, but it insists, it calls us, it haunts us. And so when we read this each week, we're not saying this is us, right? We are the community imagined in the community statement. We have arrived. This is the way we live together and treat each other. No. We're saying again, we think it's really important that we continue to hear this call. And so each week we put this out in front of ourselves. We commit ourselves again to hearing that call, and then we take another step. Sort of the reality, the life, the formation that's imagined in these commitments that are in the community statement. So maybe that's another thing, commitments. These are some commitments that we make to each other, because there are sort of some concrete ideas in it. We commit to journey, to diversity, to not making assumptions, to avoiding offense, to asking, to articulating, to doing everything in love and grace. So we make those commitments every week. When we say this, we agree to do that. But again, the commitments aren't the thing. They're not the location, they're not the land. We find the formation happens not when we get there, but when we wander together and sort of hold these commitments together all along the way. And that's the search and the desire and the dream and the trust, and really the acknowledgement that the reason we hold these commitments is because of the way that we choose to be with our fellow pilgrims. And so we hold them together. It's not so simple as you get to believe the right thing, or you get to just do a certain thing and then you arrive. Faith is really much more than that. This sort of uncertain journey, and it's definitely fraught with perils, but it's also overflowing with the joys, all of that experience sort of together on the road, which we're going to get into next week, metaphor of journey. So again, what is it? Promised land, hoped for experience, a call, a bunch of commitments. As usual, Jim Kane 2 weeks ago at Occupy sort of cut to the issue at hand and said, well, before we get to the what, we need to get to the why. And he hadn't even seen the video yet, and he knew to ask that question. That's impressive. So he was asking sort of the question that precedes the community statement, why, right? We say this every week, but why do we value highly? And why do we agree? And why do we challenge? And why do we strive? And why don't we assume? And why do we believe? And all that. So if the community statement is a what, he was asking what's the why? What's sort of that thing behind it? And again, we've just kind of said it's not binary. And I know I'm shifting back sort of the language from the video. But that question did get me thinking, and it's one that, again, thank God I haven't been able to resolve because I don't think it's supposed to be. But the community statement lives sort of between those categories. It's an enigma. It's not a traditional mission statement or a value statement or vision. It sort of hovers between worlds. And so it refuses to be only the motive, and it also refuses to only be the goal. And it sort of resists being just the what, because it's loaded with ambition. And yet it seems to be refusing to only be the why, the motive, because it does have those really concrete commitments. This is who we're going to be and how we're going to be together. So, and Kathy said when we were talking at Trilogy, it's not a statement of faith, right? Like you go into a lot of churches and there's a statement of faith that's read, like we believe all these things. Primarily, she said, because statements of faith are historical. And so they're kind of fixed, but the community statement is perpetual. It's alive. It's something that's sort of always coming and going and cycling and sort of inviting us in and pushing us out. In Peter Rollins' language, I think he would say it seems to be both theory and technology. And so he says a lot of times what you get, and he says this is the way most often the church works, is that someone somewhere makes a decision about what everyone's going to believe, and that's their theology, and then the church is the technology. So what are we going to do? What are going to be the practices and the services? And so there's all these really totally separate reasons. These are the whys, and then the technology is this is what we're going to do. Community statement sort of resists that. It's both theory and technology, the what and the why, which again is a gift, because I think that flexibility and the fluidity allows us to sort of play on both sides of it. We can go deeper into the whys that are behind the community statement, and then we can ask more specific questions, things we might not have even thought of about what we might do as a result of the ambition that's articulated in the community statement. So it gives us a lot of room to play with it, which is kind of what I want to play around with a little bit over the next 8 or 9 weeks. So if it's a what, Jim asked, then what's the why? Just a few thoughts on here. I think part of the why, I can't agree more. I think love is clearly it. I think we talk a lot about the school of love. I think that's the most clear why behind what we do. But I like the idea of the search to belong. Again, sort of what Kathy had said, it's a longing to be. And I think, you've got, throughout the Christian tradition, but I also think throughout the monastic traditions, conventional mysticism, you find that the search to belong is met in community, not in theology. And so I think there's something really life-giving about us saying every week, instead of, these are all the things we believe, and if you don't believe, don't bother, instead saying, we all believe very different things, and depending on the week. But this is how we want to be. This is how we want to be together, and this is what we think is going to pull us together. So there's that search to belong. The search for God. We could go for hours on this. Not enough time. But again, I want to argue that the search for God is actually always a response to a call, right? Because no one just gets up one day and goes, well, I think I need to go find God. Usually something happens and they hear or they see or there's an experience. So it's a response to some sort of call that sets them on that search. I love this. John Caputo, he says he was a philosopher, but I think he's really a poet. He says, we are cut by something wondrous, we know not what. The end. I think for most people, that's the beginning of the search. We hear something, we experience something, we sort of get that wonder, and we're sort of off and running, going, what is that? I need to know more about it. And then we're given a bunch of answers, and we go, oh, that makes sense. And then after a while, we go, no, that's kind of bullshit. And then we start over, and we keep going. So, and I love that. This was actually I know I'm like fanboying John Caputo this week. This was he published this on Christmas Day. And it was a super long post because he's a philosopher. But one of the lines, God is the name we call the thing that doesn't care what we call it. Yes! So good. I love it. And so the language that I used about what the community statement is, that it doesn't exist, it insists, that comes from Caputo's theology of God. He says God doesn't exist on the order of being, as if God is a being. He says God is the name of a call. God is that thing that calls us towards, it's this, that sort of sacred voice, the ground of being, that out of which all being arises, to which it returns, back to that sort of promised land stuff. I don't need to go into all that. We're going to skip that. Search to belong, the search for God, maybe that's the why behind some of it. And then on the flip side, if the community statement is the why, then what's the what? If the community statement is the theory, what's the technology? And so for example, if somebody says, well, why in the world do you do Sunday Soul Brunch, right? If Sunday Soul Brunch is the what, we might say the why is because, we do it because we're different people from different places and backgrounds. We do it because we don't assume fluency in the Bible or spirituality or church language. We do it because we believe that the message of Jesus is not just for Christianity, for people in churches, but for humanity, for people that hang out at brunch, at bars, at whatever. And so that's maybe a why behind some of the very specific things we do, why we get together on Sunday nights, why we have community groups, that kind of thing. But big picture, if the community statement is the why, what's the what? School of Love, which I think, I love this, the quote that was at the end of the Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time book group, at the end of Borg's book. He says, gather the people, tell the story, break the bread. So a school of love, maybe put most simply, is community, it's learning, and it's practice. It's gathering the people, it's telling the story, some element of the recollection of tradition, of teaching, of learning, and then practicing together, and that's breaking the bread, and that's all the other things we do. So a school of love, And then beyond that, I think we could say, if the community statement is the why, the what is everything else we do. And I think it's being intentional about holding it up against the community statement and saying, is this a faithful expression of these ideals that we sort of laid out to ourselves, sort of the map that we keep looking back at to make sure we're headed in the right direction. And so that, I think, is with everything we do. So, and I actually think I heard this almost word for word at one of the tables. I can't remember where. The community statement is the what for the deeper whys that bring us together. So that could be the search. And the community statement is the why for everything we're committed to now that we've come together. So it's sort of a bridge that puts those things together. It resists being either one. It lives in both worlds. Yeah, I'm going to skip that whole thing. Don't need that. I usually edit during the week so that this is done when I get up here. Didn't happen this week. Shoot, that doesn't make any sense without that other stuff. Yeah, I know. It's been a long season, friends. I don't want to do this. You know what? I think that's probably good. So we're together. I guess you've heard enough of the story. I do want to just point out, not to protect my fragile feelings, but a sermon has never gotten that level of applause as when I said I was going to stop. The table of this community, for whatever reason you've been drawn together, and for whatever the expression of these ambitions and ideals will sort of push us to as we journey together in the future, the table of this community is set. It's set for us, but it is open to all people, and no one will ever be turned away. So when you're ready, feel free to come on up, grab a piece of bread, dip it in the cup,